Chapter 42, Chapter 37. Monday morning, every student in Hogwarts received a free copy of the Quibbler. Most would have tossed it aside if they hadn't seen the rather hard-to-ignore images splashed across the front of it. Raw, bleeding hands, scratched and marked in a way that would be familiar to many. I must not tell lies. I will not misbehave. I will obey my betters. Eliza picked up her own copy curiously. Horror at Hogwarts, What the Ministry Doesn't Want You to Know by Rita Skeeter Hogwarts. A second home for some, a well-known, illustrious school to others, and for many home to many fond memories. What I have found out today, from students who put themselves in peril to deliver this news, should horrify you all. Instead of telling you the news, dear readers, I have instead chosen to let these anonymous testimonies speak for themselves. The students deserve to be heard after all they've been through to get published. It started immediately in September when Dolores Umbridge was appointed as our defense teacher. At first, we didn't think it was a cause for concern, but then she banned all defense practice in class time. We weren't allowed to cast a single spell. Dolores Umbridge, in case you didn't know, readers, is undersecretary to the minister. The very same minister who has promised us only the finest for our children's education. A different student writes, At first we figured we'd just practice by ourselves, but then she banned all clubs and organizations of more than 3 people who met regularly unless it got her seal of approval. Not many student-organized clubs did. You might be assuming at this point it's a new ministry-mandated health and safety campaign. We all know how dangerous some of the clubs at Hogwarts could get. What comes next will prove you wrong. So she started inspecting our classes, but we all noticed she only ever turned up in classes that had troublesome students. Whenever we spoke out of turn or questioned her ideals, we were punished. I don't know how many of us have been subjected to her detentions, but what proof we could get we sent in today. Every testimony I have read agrees. Dolores Umbridge has been using blood quills on our children. Not only is this corporeal punishment illegal, but it also defies the minister's own laws on blood magic. You may be questioning how this has been allowed to continue for so long, dear readers, and I'm afraid to say this academic year only becomes worse. Eliza read through the rest of the article with a smug grin. Rita truly had done a wonderful job. She had even mentioned she had suspicions about the trial being blocked when a student tried to contest Umbridge. By now everyone had read through the Quibbler, and the great hall had filled with loud, clamoring chatter of the students. Eliza took one long sip of her coffee as she took in the chaos around her. Umbridge was sat at the teacher's table, lips pursed, and a look of fury in her eyes. A copy of the Quibbler was scrunched up in front of her. Theo was the best in their group at chess. That was undeniable. But when it came to real-life political maneuvering, Eliza had them all beat, hands down. Eliza drained the last of her coffee, not taking her eyes off the toad. Her move. By mid-morning, enormous signs had been pinned on seemingly every spare bit of wall in the castle. Educational Decree Number 27, any student found with a copy of the Quibbler would be expelled. By the end of the day, she had been approached by Luna. Apparently no other copy of the Quibbler had ever sold out faster. Don't you just love it? Eliza spoke lying on the sofa next to Daphne. When things work out. Don't you just love it when you con a 4th year into letting you use her father's magazine to stage a coup against the minister? Daphne retorted and stopped Draco from copying her Transfiguration S with a well-placed, fluffy-socked kick. Well, yes, but that's just a mouthful, isn't it? Eliza responded, and Daphne snorted slightly. You do know that Umbridge is going to be out for your blood after this, right? Blaise asked, and Eliza leveled him with a blood-thirsty grin. Oh, I'm counting on it. This was just the first step in her ruination of the toad. Eliza planned to enjoy it. The next day, Eliza wasn't surprised to find that she had been summoned by Umbridge for a small chat. As far as Blaise had been able to gather 5 other people before Eliza had been summoned by Umbridge, all 5 of whom had consented to allowing photos of their blood quill detentions to be publicized. Obviously, Umbridge was trying to put a stop to Eliza's Quibbler coup as soon as possible. Not that it would negate the damage already done. According to Tom, the minister actually had to evacuate from his office today on account of all the howlers. She was having a good day all in all, until she had to walk into Umbridge's office. There were notably less kitten plates on the walls, than when Eliza had last visited, she was pleased to note. The toad herself was sat behind her desk with a sugary, sweet smile that had Eliza feeling slightly murderous. Deciding to play innocent for now, Eliza slipped into the chair across from Umbridge, plastering a polite smile onto her face as she did so. "Good afternoon, Professor. What's going on?" she asked, and Umbridge's plastic smile didn't even twitch. In the rise of recent events, Umbridge began, and Eliza couldn't help but glance at the damning copy of the Quibbler sat on the desk. "I have decided to check in on my students in the face of this absurd propaganda. Of course, Professor." Eliza demurred and watched curiously as Umbridge set about making a cup of tea. "I have to look out for the students after all. The minister himself has tasked me with the upkeeping of Hogwarts. Do you take sugar in your tea, Miss Potter?" "Just the one," Eliza replied lightly, and watched when Umbridge turned her back slightly to presumably add sugar to the tea. "Now, Miss Potter, you understand, I have to ask some routine questions on the matter." Umbridge began saccharine sweet, but Eliza could easily recognize the sadistic gleam in the woman's eyes. "You didn't have anything to do with this, did you, Miss Potter?" Eliza reeled back as if shocked by the accusation. They both knew they were playing a tenuous game, but at this point, it seemed that Umbridge wasn't going to reveal her hand. Eliza certainly wasn't. "Of course not, Professor. I wouldn't dare disobey my betters." Eliza kept a soft, polite smile on her face, but she didn't even need to look to know that her eyes were hard and steely. A frown flashed across Umbridge's face before it was replaced with a tight smile. "You've hardly touched your tea, dear. Drink up." Luna's warning rang through her head. Eliza raised the teacup to her mouth, and Umbridge's smile widened almost grotesquely. She pretended to take a sip, and instead focused intensely on trying to siphon away some of the obviously drugged drink. Eliza placed the cup down with a clatter, and Umbridge leaned forward slightly. "Miss Potter, did you organize, or help organize this article?" Umbridge questioned, jabbing one stubby finger at the Quibbler. "That bitch." She must have slipped Veritaseum into Eliza's tea in hopes of gaining a confession. Lucky for Eliza, her ever-constant paranoia had once again saved her ass. It wasn't even paranoia at this point. Eliza just knew to expect the worst in any given scenario. "No, Professor Umbridge," Eliza replied in a slightly dazed voice and pretended to take another sip of the tea, feeling sweat bead on her forehead. Banishment was a sixth-year transfiguration topic. Eliza could do it non-verbally without a fuss, but to also do it without a wand. That was a lot harder. She was just glad she had kept up with her meditation. A look of blatant fury crossed across Umbridge's face, and the toad almost snarled out her question. "Are you conspiring against me?" "No, Professor Umbridge," Eliza replied in the same polite, dazed tone and set down her now empty teacup. A look of unhinged fury swept over her face. "Tell me who did this," she demanded. "Tell me now." "I don't know, Professor Umbridge," Eliza said, perfectly neutral, and did her best to smother her growing satisfaction. The toad dismissed her with a shriek, and Eliza left the office quietly. And as she closed the door, she heard the sound of a teacup shattering and grinned madly. By the end of the week, the Quibbler was officially declared propaganda by the minister himself. And when he released the information to the Daily Prophet about Death Eaters hidden among our ranks, nobody believed it. According to Tom, everyone thought Fudge was a witless, desperate man trying to make himself looking like a hero. Nobody supported him, and instead the Quibbler had to be reprinted as they had sold out of all copies, just as they had predicted. Check. Hearing that Professor Trelawney had been sacked honestly wasn't that much of a surprise. The woman was a fraud anyway, and had also recited the prophecy that had somewhat ruined her life, so Eliza wasn't particularly sad about her going. She was sad that she had missed the send-off, though. She had been in the chamber with Jormy practicing her necromancy when Umbridge had tried to evict Trelawney from the castle. She had a feeling watching her ex-divination professor's failed eviction would have been a lot more entertaining than staring at a rat skeleton for the past hour fanatically trying to breathe life into it. Draco had been more than happy to tell her what had happened, however, and Eliza had listened indulgently. But it seemed that Draco had left out one crucial detail in his narration, probably on purpose, about her new divination teacher. Because her new divination teacher was a centaur. Exiled from his herd and teaching divination at Hogwarts, The class was everything Eliza knew it would be the second she stepped in through the doors. Mind-boggling. The classroom itself had been transformed into a woodland area with no chairs or desks. The ceiling was coated in a projection of the night sky, which made Eliza wonder why they even bothered with the astronomy tower. It was quite calming, really, if it wasn't for the fact that the centaur seemed to block out her whole existence. Eliza had no problem with centaurs. She even found their planetary studies quite fascinating and was enjoying a fresh perspective on divination. She just didn't know why her new teacher was eyeing her like she was the devil incarnate. Some would argue that Eliza was the devil incarnate, but at least those people usually had evidence. So when her new class came to an end, Eliza loitered behind to try and smooth things over with her newest teacher. She hadn't even opened her mouth before the centaur wheeled around to face her with a glare. "If it was up to me, Death's Child, I would not have you in this classroom," Forenza said flatly, and Eliza barely stopped herself from jolting backwards. Death's Child. That must mean he knew about her. We do not tolerate Death's children near our tribe, but the stars themselves warned us about you, Eliza Potter, Forenza continued. Eliza wasn't easy to intimidate. She was barely even intimidated by the Dark Lord, but this. There was a look in Forenza's eyes that Eliza truly didn't like. This was a being who could commune with the heavens themselves, and he was looking at her like she deserved to die. "Let me guess," Eliza drawled, tilting her chin up. "They told you I would do great things, terrible things, but great." The centaur didn't even blink, but Eliza already had the confirmation she needed. "Just stop glaring at me in class, and I won't ever try and speak to you again." She snapped and then strode out the room, letting the door swing shut behind her. Death's Child, that might be her most ominous moniker yet. March trudged on. Umbridge had been almost quiet since trying to drug Eliza, at least when it came to direct confrontations. More and more inane educational decrees came out by the day, but they weren't problems if you ignored them, something Eliza was rather good at. She had started her OWL project for ancient runes, and it had yet to catch on fire, which was a good thing. Alchemy was a whole other story. Quill and ink plus messy handwriting didn't mean anything good when one was hurriedly scrawling down calculations. She had been trying to shift a piece of lead into a piece of tin only for the stupid thing to blow up. She put the fire out before anyone noticed. Public outcry had not lessened, but Fudge was refusing to hold any trials on accounts of misinformation and propaganda. Everyone knew his months in office were limited, and already a few campaigns had started up. Rufus Scrimgeour, for one, an old ruthless aura who, whilst not in Dumbledore's pocket, was still as fanatical. There were the typical old purebloods throwing money around thinking they had any chance of actually being elected, Ogden being a notable name. Not one wizard from the dark sect was even foolish enough to jump into the race, leaving all the old traditionalists to either back a light fanatic or another push over desperately clamoring for more power, i.e. Fudge. She had no idea what Tom was doing about it all. It wasn't necessarily important. None of their plans particularly hinged on having one of their own in office, but it would be a big help. The minister could technically veto any bill that the Wisengamot passed, but that happened far and few between. They didn't need to have the minister on their side. They just needed one that would be ambivalent to Tom's maneuverings, which meant Rufus Scrimgeour could cause some problems. But then again, she was pretty sure Tom had half the Wisengamot in his pocket already. He really didn't need the minister that much. Plus, there's always their good old standby, the Imperious Curse. Eliza loved magic. Another flash of lightning crackled angrily across the sky, successfully jolting Eliza out of her musings. The rain was hammering down around her as she stood in a secluded spot by the Black Lake, another low rumbling of thunder reminding her why she was here in the first place. Apparently, a person's animagus form usually reflected what their patroness was. Eliza's wouldn't. Her patroness was a hippogriff, and according to ever text on the subject she had found, wizards couldn't have a magical creature as their animagus. A wizard's body couldn't handle the transformation into a magical creature. When you were in your animal form, your magic is used to sustain that animal form, and not anything else. If you were to be a magical creature, you would have to find an excess of magic somewhere to cover the magical properties of said creature, which, as most texts agreed, would lead to death. So really Eliza had no idea what her animagus form could be, She was willing to bet on it being a snake of some kind, though. Raising her potions phial to her eyes, Eliza took in a deep breath, raising her wand to hot as the cold rain splashed against her face. Amato animo animato animagus. She incanted softly and uncorked her phial, downing it in one go and grimacing at the taste. Immediately, despite the storm around her, Eliza felt herself burning up, a strange heat burrowing into her bones as she fought hard to concentrate. It was a rather disconcerting experience, she noted detachedly, to feel your body changing but your mind staying the same. She fell to the ground and assumed she must have blacked out for a few seconds because when she came back around, she immediately felt different. Blinking, disorientated, she tried to stand up only to trip over her own feet. Not feet, paws. She had paws. Shaking her head in frustration, she let out a small little growl before pushing herself up, standing up straight on her 4 legs. Eliza, her name was important. She had to remember that, shook out her increasing wet fur with a disgruntled yip, and went back to studying herself, and after a few embarrassing seconds of chasing her own tail, trotted over to the lake to study her reflection. A pointed orangish head stared back at her, and she was sure, or as sure as she could be with her slightly color-blind vision, that her eyes would be their usual bright, vibrant green if her reflection were anything to go by. She was a fox. Eliza's ears swiveled slightly as another roll of thunder echoed, and she determined to explore the forbidden forest in her new form and get out of the storm. Letting out a happy yip, Eliza dashed into the forest, only stumbling once or twice as she got used to her new speed. The smells and sounds were overwhelming, and Eliza span in a circle trying to figure out where to head first before deciding to go randomly. Her thoughts were simpler like this. Everything was just the next interesting smell, the next strange noise, the next adventure. She had the whole night to explore. She spent hours darting about the forest, leaping and prancing around in the undergrowth before she decided to go back for her wand and sneak back into the cast. She rather wanted a nice hot bath after rolling about in mud for the past 2 hours. A fox. Honestly, she should have been able to guess. Eliza woke up early the next morning, body somewhat sore from her transformation yesterday. She was glad it was Saturday. Daphne was already awake, sat up on her bed across from Eliza, painting her nails a nice shimmery silver with an intense look of concentration on her face. Eliza sighed and shook her duvet off herself and grabbed her hairbrush off the side of her table. "And where were you last night?" Daphne asked, noticing Eliza was now up and about. "I hope you weren't sneaking about any broom closets," she teased, and Eliza scoffed. The only person she was interested in snogging was an emotionally repressed Dark Lord. "Thank you very much." "I think I should be asking you that," Eliza shot back with a grin as Daphne sniffed up in contempt. "I have a lot more class than that. Ah yes, I'm sure Susan thinks the abandoned charms classroom is the height of romance." Daphne blushed bright red. "How did you know about that?" she squeaked, looking just a bit mortified. Eliza laughed slightly and threw her hair up into a high ponytail. "Blaze, I'm going to kill him," Daphne threatened. "I'd help," Eliza replied instantly, and Daphne let out a light laugh before she pointed a finger in Eliza's direction, frowning slightly. "You still haven't told me where you were last night, Missy." Eliza felt her lips pull into a grin that she knew spelled nothing but trouble, and started raiding her chest for some casual clothes before spying Draco's old Quidditch jersey, the one that didn't have blood on it. "There was a storm last night," Eliza said with a conspiring smile as Daphne continued to look at her blankly, raising a perfectly arched eyebrow. "And you didn't think I was stealing mandrake leaves just for fun, did you?" Eliza questioned and watched as a look of shock appeared on Daphne's face. "Holy shit," the blonde uttered, and Eliza shifted into her fox form, pouncing on Daphne's bed clumsily. "Holy S-hit." Eliza shifted back and let out a loud laugh as Daphne instantly pulled her into a huge hug, pulling away slightly to give her an evil grin. "We so have to prank the boys." Daphne really was the best. The boys didn't agree. Sneaking into their dorm had been surprisingly easy. Draco, Theo and Blaze shared one, and Eliza was sure they had bullied Crab and Goyle into moving out in second year. Daphne waited by the door, not stepping in just yet, and Eliza transformed into her fox form. This was the first time she had been in the boys' room. Theo and Draco were still asleep. but Blaze was surprisingly awake, reading a novel Eliza was sure was written in Italian. Eliza was touched to see he still had the present she had made him in first year. A tiny model of a glass wolf sat on his desk. When he spotted Daphne, he went to make a noise, but Daphne shushed him quietly with a mischievous grin and gestured to Eliza, who was sneaking towards Draco's bed. Draco's corner of the room was decked out in Quidditch posters and photos of them all pinned to the walls. If it weren't for the truly chaotic pile of shoes by his bed, Eliza would say it was even neat. Neater than Theo's by far. Eliza should have known Theo wouldn't be tidy. Books were stacked all around his bed in haphazard piles, and random arithmancy equations were plastered all over the walls. Broken quills and scrunched-up parchment were cluttered all over his desk, but he too had pictures of them all, and a framed one of his mother parked on his bedside table. Eliza wasn't going to navigate that mess to scare him, so Draco it was. The Bland was snoring softly, lying flat out on his bed. Eliza jumped up and almost tumbled off before regaining her balance. She was still getting used to her fox form. Slowly, she started shimmying up the bed until she was face to face with Draco and unremarkably plunked herself on his chest. His face scrunched slightly, but he otherwise didn't move. Eliza buted her nose against his. Draco's eyes fluttered open, and the second he caught sight of her, Eliza smiled toothily, showing off her sharp teeth, and then he let out an unholy high-pitched scream. He shot up, and Eliza was shoved off by the motion and decided to transform back, her laughter instantly joining Blaze's and Daphne. As Draco panted wide-eyed at her mysterious appearance and the disappearance of the fox. It was then they heard a crash and turned to look at Theo, who upon hearing Draco's murderous scream had toppled out of his own bed and had fallen onto his stacks of books. Eliza just laughed harder, tears streaming down her face. "Merlin, I wish I'd taken a photo," Daphne gasped out between her giggles. "That was priceless," Blaze chuckled as Theo pulled himself back onto the bed and Draco gave her an abject look of confusion. "But Eliza, a fox." Eliza transformed again, and all of Draco's confusion cleared and was instead replaced with a look of fury. "You little shit," he growled. Eliza yelped when Draco lunged for her and started dashing around the dorm as Draco tried to catch her, leaping from one bed to another to avoid the furious Bland. She had no regrets. Draco and Theo pouted all the way down to breakfast, much to everyone else's amusement. Blaze had swanned off after downing a cup of coffee to meet up with Padma Patil for a study date. They all knew there would be no studying involved. Eliza, however, did intend to study. She felt like she was finally getting somewhere with her necromancy, but Draco had given one pointed look towards her stack of half-finished essays, and Eliza had slumped back down into her seat. She could do them later, or well, earlier because time travel, but Draco refused to accept that as a reason. Owls came before reanimating the dead, apparently. They all, sans Blaze, headed down to the room in the dungeons they had converted way back in their first year to do their studying. Eliza never enjoyed sitting in the library. Draco was scared of Jormy, and the room of requirement was shut more often than not these days, which left them with their old hangout spot. Theo was quietly working on his arithmancy with Daphne, and Draco was sullenly writing up his Care of Magical Creatures essay. The Monster Book of Monsters was open next to him, and whenever it started to growl he'd lean over and flick it slightly on its spine. Eliza was trying to not blow up her Ancient Runes project. It was going surprisingly well. Over the summer, when Sirius had been dragging her and Remus all over the country, they occasionally stopped in the Muggle world, the Jurassic Park incident just being one example. And in their foray to the Muggle world, Eliza had accidentally introduced Sirius to the concept of a magic 8-ball. They had stopped inside a store so Sirius could pick up a bottle of vodka. What can I say, pup? Muggles do it better. When Eliza had found a tiny magic 8-ball in the novelty section. She had picked it up with a fond smile. Back at the orphanage, Brandon Horton used to have one, and when he tried to bully her, Eliza had thrown his stupid 8-ball into his mouth so hard that she had chipped a tooth. When Sirius had seen it, he was easily entertained by the small gimmick and had spent the rest of the week asking it about every single damn thing. It had been annoying, but at least it had given her an idea. An actual magic 8-ball. Divination runes were sometimes used to predict the future, although rather vaguely, and Eliza instantly latched onto the idea of turning them into something a bit more fun and possibly a bit more marketable. Most wizards didn't bother studying divination or runes these days. Wizarding Britain was notoriously lazy, but that didn't mean it was completely out of date. She had discussed her idea with Remus over the holidays, and he had given her a charm that would imbue an object with a personality, as such, kind of like magical portraits. If Eliza could combine her runic divination and inlay the material with the charm he had given her, she should have a fully functioning magic 8-ball. A real one that could offer actual predictions, except it kept catching fire. She had this problem with her rune stones last year, and it was all about finding the right material, which was just a pain. She sort of wished she just decided to submit a boring amulet like everyone else, instead of inventing something completely new, but she did like the challenge. It would be great if the challenge came without explosions, however. Their peace was interrupted when Blaze burst through the door. "Guys, you will not fucking believe this," he said, eyes wide, and looking just a bit smug as he pranced into the room. "Eliza became an illegal animagus last night." Daphne commented, not looking up from her equations. "Try me." "I never said it was illegal," Eliza cut in swiftly, but any response to that statement was cut off by Blaze. "I came here with dramatic news." I refused to be upstaged by Eliza's illegal activities. They were right. She had no intention of registering. "Go on then," Draco said, propping his head in his hands as Blaze came to sit down at the table with them. "Tell us the news." Blaze grinned widely and leaned forward. "Well, you know how I was studying with Padma. You don't have to pretend you were studying, you know." Daphne cut in dryly, and Blaze gave her a disgruntled look over being interrupted. "Okay, so you know how I was snogging Padma." Gross, Theo interrupted this time, and Eliza had to clamp down her laughter at the sight of Blaze's affronted face. "You would be lucky to kiss these lips, lover boy." Moving on, Eliza chirped, and Blaze quickly returned to his story. "Right, okay, where was I?" Blaze asked, eyes lit up with glee. "Ah yes, Albus Dumbledore has been sacked." "What?" Eliza questioned. "Blaze, if you're having us on." "I'm not," Blaze replied. "They're announcing it at lunch today. He's officially gone." "How?" Daphne said, frowning. "Why even?" "Padma told me the whole story," Blaze gossiped. "Turns out you weren't the only one to start having extra defense lessons, Eliza. Remember Granger?" They all wrinkled their noses slightly. No one liked Granger. "Well, she started one up for like the whole of Hogwarts after getting into that argument with Umbridge. I think she and Weasley must be involved in the Order somehow, because they've been teaching them dueling and all that. Although I can't imagine they're that good mind. And of course, no Slytherins were invited in," Draco said dryly. "What a shocker. To be fair, I'm pretty sure we got the better end of the stick," Daphne said, gesturing towards her, and Eliza felt herself smile slightly at the praise. Anyway, they had a meeting last night, and they were ratted out by this Ravenclaw girl. How did all of this lead to Dumbledore getting sacked? Theo inquired steadily, and Blaze grinned wider. "I was getting to that. Turns out they called themselves Dumbledore's Army. Oh, Merlin. The minister got called in and everything. A few of them got caught, and Dumbledore took the blame for them, and then, get this, Fudge tried to arrest him," Blaze exclaimed, and Eliza, just like the rest of her court, sat there gobsmacked. "Fudge tried to arrest Albus Dumbledore," she repeated lowly, and Blaze nodded hurriedly. "Didn't succeed, obviously. Apparently he's on the run now." Silence descended on them all. This was the second time Dumbledore had been removed from his post at Hogwarts. Surely he couldn't be allowed back in next year now. He was technically a criminal, although she doubted many people would believe that. When it came to the Ministry or Dumbledore, even Eliza would bet on the old man instead. She couldn't believe the old man was actually gone, all through some stupid Gryffindors. "Wait," Draco said in growing horror, and Eliza looked at him curiously. "If Dumbledore's gone, then who's the head of the school?" Blaze looked at them all in pity. "I think you know." "Fuck," Theo cursed. Eliza looked down at her test magic 8-ball. "Chances of Umbridge not becoming headmistress?" Eliza asked, and gave the thing a shake, plonking it down on the table. They all peered at it curiously as its surface swirled undecided. Eliza ducked just in time to avoid it exploding in her face. Typical. The school took to the news of Umbridge being their new headmistress about as well as her magic 8-ball did. The Slytherins had taken to unanimous malicious compliance. Sorry, Professor Umbridge, we can't tell you anything about that. It's not about defense. Sorry, Professor Umbridge, but we can't go to class today. See, my partner's a boy, and we have to be 2 feet apart. So sorry, Professor Umbridge, but Eliza would say it was going rather well. The other houses had taken up different tactics. 2 Nifflers had already been let loose in Umbridge's room, and just the other day Eliza swore she saw Professor McGonagall help Peeves loosen a chandelier. But by far the biggest backlash came from the Weasley twins, or perhaps more aptly the Weasley terrors. So Eliza wasn't surprised that by the end of the week she had been tracked down by the 2 fiends just to be unceremoniously dragged into a broom cupboard with them. How forward, Eliza remarked dryly as the 2 closed the door behind them. And here I was thinking you'd at least buy me dinner first. The twins snorted and gave her an unimpressed look. If we actually tried to make a move on you, your boyfriend would rip out our spines. If we tried to make a move on you, you would rip out our spines. I don't have a boyfriend, Eliza said easily and shuffled further into the surprisingly roomy closet. 2 words, Thomas Gaunt, well, he was a bit possessive. What do you 2 want? Eliza questioned, deciding to cut to the chase. The 2 weren't surprised by her abrupt change in behavior, and instead, impassibly, their grins became wider. Well, dear Ellie, what have I told you about calling me that? We've decided our talents are wasted here. We want to fly from the nest, so to speak, George finished. It sounded like George, at least. And you want to leave complete chaos in your wake, Eliza said, arching an eyebrow. Exactly, they chimed in unison with a nod of their heads, and Eliza sighed. What do you need? Fred smiled at her. It's not what you can do for us, but rather what we can do for you. We have a mutual acquaintance, a dog of a man, honestly. Eliza had to smother a smirk, and he told us about his glory days and a certain map. Eliza had heard about the Marauders' map from Sirius and Remus. It really was an impressive bit of magic. They let Filch confiscate it in their last year sew up, and coming mischief makers could find it and carry on their legacy. What he didn't know was that he was talking to the 2 current owners of the masterpiece. Of course, those 2 would find it. And we think it's only right if we passed it along to the next generation. George pulled out an old, aging piece of parchment from his pocket and tapped his wand against it, murmuring the password. Eliza watched in fascination as ink spread across the parchment, mapping out the entirety of Hogwarts. Tentatively, she reached out to hold it, scanning it curiously. And you're just giving this to me? The twins nodded their heads again. Just promise us you won't use it to scare poor McLaggen. He never recovered from your first year. I have no idea what you're talking about, Eliza replied promptly and shoved the map into her bag after wiping it clean. That map would be useful, very useful. Sure you don't, they said, but they looked more amused than anything. Well, it's been a pleasure, boys. Eliza spoke and started moving out of the broom cupboard, pausing before she stepped out entirely. Good luck, she said, and then disappeared around the corner. That day, Eliza watched with a small smile as the twins left, leaving absolute chaos in their wake. Exploding, multiplying fireworks, portable swamps, and giant caches of skiving snack boxes stored about the castle. And if they received an anonymous donation a few days later to help the startup of their business, then well, that could stay a secret. She really quite liked those Weasley twins. But soon Eliza and her court had bigger things to dwell on than Umbridge, as remnants of fireworks and swamps were replaced by sleek, glossy pamphlets and a growing existential dread. Careers Day had arrived. She and her court were all sat in the common room, far more subdued than usual as they waited to be called into Severus' office one by one. There was nothing Eliza hated more than Careers Day. Daphne was called in first, then Draco, then Theo and Blaise. They all came out with pensive frowns, but small smiles, and Eliza told them all she'd meet them by the Black Lake after her meeting with Severus. It was a nice day today. It would be a shame to waste it. Eliza frowned when Severus finally called her into his office. What she would give to have Roll right now, or Gemma, or Roman. It seemed their year had been the last competent older year Slytherins her house had. With a sigh, Eliza trudged into the office, but straightened her shoulders and tilted her chin up before she walked in, forcing a spring into her steps. Good morning, Professor. Eliza chirped out and threw herself down into the seat across from Severus at his desk. You can cut the act, Eliza. Draco already told me you've been moping all morning." Eliza slumped across the desk, and Severus snorted at the sight of a defeated Eliza Potter. Eliza lifted her eyes up so she could meet the professor's and let out a long, drawn-out sigh. "I wouldn't have thought Careers Day would be the one thing to get you to shut up," her professor remarked, and Eliza sulked even more. "Well, miracles do happen," Eliza said dryly, and Severus looked at her considering. "Indeed," he hummed, and they fell into an odd sort of silence. "Well, go on then. What career are you thinking of chasing, Miss Potter?" Eliza stayed silent before heaving herself up, propping her chin up in her hand. "Revenge and retribution," Eliza replied promptly, and Severus let out one of the most exasperated sighs she had ever heard. And Remus had once found Padfoot stuck in a muggle bin outside their house. "Ruining Dumbledore's life is not an occupation, Eliza." "It could be," Eliza said sullenly, and started staring at the weird, creepy potion files Severus kept in his office with a disturbing amount of focus. "Why are you struggling with this, Eliza?" Severus asked finally. "Out of all my students, I thought you would have been the one I didn't need to worry about." Because Eliza was ambitious, wasn't she? Ambitious and doggedly determined, a quintessential Slytherin in every respect. She should have her goals all lined up like dominoes in front of her. When Eliza was younger, still at the orphanage, just out of the Dursleys, she had a small, ratty journal. A small, battered one, before she stole the one from Camden to document her magic in. No, this notebook had been dedicated to Eliza's bucket list, so to speak, full of all her goals and aims and muggle life. She planned to study the sciences, get rich and get out. It was full of things like that. 1. Leave the orphanage. 8. Try seafood. 18. American-style road trip. 25. Go to the theater. 30. Buy apartment. 31. Buy houseplant for new apartment. Childish muggle hopes and wishes of an orphan girl who knew she was special but had no idea how. Since she had joined the wizarding world, she had set her sights on revenge and retribution, complete and utter change, becoming powerful. She hadn't wasted a moment and worked to catch up and overtake her peers. She knew she was going into politics, and she also knew she was about to lead a secret war against one of the most influential men in Wizarding Britain, with one of the other most influential men in Wizarding Britain. She was made for war, not normality. Severus let her dwell in her thoughts a bit more before he spoke again. "When I was your age, having this exact conversation," he began seriously, "I said I wanted to be a potions master because I needed money and I was talented. And you know what else?" Eliza shook her head slowly. "I knew the Dark Lord was looking for a potions master, so I saw my chance to be more than what I came from, and I took it." Severus didn't have to say that he regretted his choices. Eliza already knew he did. "So please, Eliza, I'm asking you now to think of a life outside of the war." "What do you want?" Thea would be taking his seat on the Wisengamot and possibly continue his arithmancy. She knew Blaise planned to live off his inheritance alone, although he was interested in curse-breaking. Daphne wanted to become a healer, and Draco was looking into getting a charms mastery before he became Lord Malfoy. And Eliza didn't know. It was hard to think of anything outside the war, hard to organize her thoughts and think of a career, a normal life. "I expect you to come into my office at the end of the year," Severus said, with at least a vague idea that doesn't involve murder. Eliza cracked a grin and started heading towards the lake to join her court when Severus dismissed her. She didn't know, but she swore by the end of the year she would.